The town of Frost End, Alaska, wasn't on any map I'd ever studied. It wasn't a destination. It was the place you ended up when everything else had failed you. My Civic had sputtered its last breath somewhere between Fairbanks and nowhere, leaving me stranded on a highway that stretched like a gray ribbon through an endless expanse of spruce and silence. The mechanic in town, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains, had given me the news with all the warmth of a February wind. 2 weeks, maybe 3, for the parts to arrive, maybe longer. I had $87 in my checking account, and a maxed out credit card I was already 3 months behind on. The motel wanted $60 a night. I did the math in my head, the kind of desperate arithmetic that makes your chest tighten, and realized I had maybe 2 days before I'd be sleeping in my dead car. That's when I saw it. The Aurora Borealis diner sat like a defiant beacon at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering against the vast, indifferent sky. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been transplanted from the 1950s and left to weather alone. Chrome trim dulled by decades of harsh winters, windows that reflected more than they revealed. But taped to the inside of the front door, written in what looked like desperate handwriting, was a sign: "Help Wanted, Night Shift." I pushed through the door and a bell chimed with a hollow, lonely sound. The woman behind the counter looked up from a stack of receipts, and I saw her face cycle through a series of emotions in rapid succession. Hope, then caution, then something that looked disturbingly like resignation. She was in her 50s, maybe older, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and deep lines etched around her eyes, the kind that come from years of not sleeping well. "We're not hiring," she said, but her eyes drifted back to the sign on the door, betraying her. "The sign says you are," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I'd learned long ago not to show desperation, even when it was gnawing at your insides. She studied me for a long moment, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You from around here?" "Car broke down. I need work while it's being fixed. Where are you from?" I hesitated. Does it matter? Something in my tone must have resonated with her, because her expression softened just slightly. "Marta," she said, not offering her hand. "The night shift is 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Minimum wage plus tips, though you won't get many of those. It's mostly coffee and pie for truckers and the occasional insomniac." She paused, then added, "It's not easy work. I can handle hard work." That's not what I said. She turned and pulled an apron from beneath the counter, navy blue with Aurora Borealis diner, stitched in fading gold thread. As she handed it to me, she reached into her shirt pocket and withdrew a laminated card about the size of a playing card. "This comes with the job. Read it. Memorize it. Follow every rule exactly as written." I took the card. It was worn smooth at the edges from countless hands, the lamination yellowing with age. At the top in block letters, Aurora Borealis Diner, night shift rules. Below it, 6 rules were printed in small, precise type. I scanned them quickly. Something about Booth 3, a song, windows showing wrong weather, a child's voice, a storm cellar door, and the Vulov family. They read like the kind of joke rules you'd see in a horror movie. The ones the doomed characters laugh off before everything goes wrong. "Is this serious?" I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. Marta's face went rigid, her eyes hard as flint. "Your life depends on it," she said, and there was nothing in her voice but fear and absolute certainty. "Memorize them tonight. Your first shift is tomorrow. Be here at 7:45. I'll train you for the first few nights." I wanted to ask more, but something in the set of her shoulders told me the conversation was over. I took the apron and the card and left, the bell chiming behind me like a warning I didn't yet understand. The next 3 nights passed in a strange, tense routine. Marta showed me the basics. The coffee machine that rattled like it had tuberculosis, the ancient cash register that required a specific angle of pressure to open, the walk-in freezer that was colder than it had any right to be. But mostly, she showed me Booth 3. It sat in the corner near the north-facing windows, a standard 4-seater with red vinyl seats that were somehow more pristine than any other booth in the diner. The table was spotless. The salt and pepper shakers were full and aligned with geometric precision. It looked like it was waiting for someone. Never seat anyone there between 900 p.m. and 9:45 p.m. Marta instructed on my first night, her voice low and urgent. "If someone tries to sit there during that window, redirect them. Be polite, but firm. Why? Because it's reserved. For who?" She looked at me with those exhausted eyes, and I saw something in them that made my skin prickle. For people who don't need menus. Around 11 p.m. on my second night, a couple came in, young, probably tourists who'd gotten turned around and made a beeline for booth 3. I was at the counter, but Marcia moved with surprising speed, intercepting them with a bright, strained smile. "So sorry, that booth is reserved, but I've got a lovely window seat right over here." She guided them to booth 5 with a firm hand on the man's elbow. The couple exchanged confused glances but didn't argue. After they left, Marta returned to the counter and poured herself a coffee with shaking hands. "Marta," I said quietly, "what's really going on here?" "Follow the rules, Anya," she replied, not meeting my eyes. "Just follow the rules." On my third night, I learned why. It was a Tuesday, which meant it was slow. We'd had 2 customers all evening. A trucker who drank 4 cups of coffee and left a $1 tip, and an old woman who ordered soup and stared out the window at the empty highway like she was waiting for someone who would never arrive. By 9:00 p.m., the diner was empty, except for Marta and me. Marta checked her watch, an old Timex with a cracked face and her entire body tensed. "It's time," she said softly. "Remember rule 1, do not approach the booth. Do not make eye contact." "With who?" I asked. But she'd already turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving me alone in the front. I stood behind the counter, the laminated card in my pocket, suddenly feeling like it weighed 10 lb. The clock on the wall ticked forward. 9:14, 9:15. They appeared without sound, without warning, without any of the dramatic flourishes you'd expect. One moment, booth 3 was empty. The next, a family of 4 sat there, perfectly still. A man, broad-shouldered and wearing a brown corduroy jacket that looked decades out of style. A woman in a floral dress with a cardigan, her dark hair pinned up. A boy, maybe 12, in a striped shirt. A little girl, no more than 8, in a yellow dress with white trim. The Vulovs. I should have looked away. Rule 1 was explicit, but I was frozen, my rational mind struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. They weren't transparent or ghostly in any cinematic sense. They were solid, real, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Their movements were just a fraction too slow, like watching a video with the frame rate dropped. Their clothing had the muted, slightly faded quality of old photographs. I watched from the corner of my eye, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. The father, Ivan, I would later learn, was looking out the north-facing window. As I watched, his expression began to change. Confusion gave way to concern, then to dawning horror. His mouth opened, and though I heard no sound, I could read the shape of a scream forming. The mother, Sasha, turned to look where he was looking, and I saw her face crumple into the same expression of absolute terror. The children clutched at their parents, their small faces twisted in fear. The little girl buried her head in her mother's shoulder. The boy's eyes were wide, reflecting something I couldn't see but could feel. Something vast and cold and unstoppable. The lights in the diner flickered once, twice. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath came out in visible puffs. The north-facing windows, which had been showing the clear June night, suddenly bloomed with frost, intricate patterns spreading across the glass like accusations written in ice. Beyond them, I could have sworn I saw a blizzard raging, snow horizontal in a wind that shouldn't exist. And then, between one blink and the next, they were gone. Booth 3 was empty. The windows were clear. The temperature returned to normal. The only evidence that anything had happened was the faint condensation on the glass and my racing heartbeat. Marta emerged from the kitchen, her face pale but unsurprised. She walked to booth 3 and wiped down the table with a rag, though there was nothing to wipe. Her movements were mechanical, ritualistic. "Sit down," she said, not looking at me. I moved to a stool at the counter on shaking legs. Marta poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me. For a long moment, she just stared into her cup, watching the steam rise. "Their name was Vulov," she finally said, her voice hollow and distant. "Ivan and Sasha, and their children, Alexei and Lena, January 15th, 1971. There was a blizzard, one of the worst in recorded history for this region. They were driving from Anchorage to visit family in Fairbanks. About 20 minutes north of here, their truck went off the road." She took a sip of coffee, her hands wrapped around the mug like she was trying to draw warmth from it. "They didn't die right away," she continued. "The truck went into a ditch off the side of the highway. The crash didn't kill them. It trapped them. They were alive when the blizzard hit full force. Alive when the temperature dropped to 40 below. The search party found them the next morning." She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "They'd frozen to death. all 4 of them still in the truck. The coroner estimated it took 6 to 8 hours. I felt my stomach turn. Jesus. They don't know they're dead, Anya, Marta said, finally looking up at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. They just know the terror. Every night at 9:15 p.m., they relive that moment. The moment they looked out the window and saw the storm coming. The moment they realized no one was coming to save them, that they were going to die, over and over and over. They've been doing it for 54 years. How is that possible, I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. There's something here, she said. Something wrong with this place. Or maybe something that was drawn here by what happened to them. I don't know which came first. A man who used to work here, Old Man Hemlock. He called it the Echo Eater. He spent years trying to understand it. Wrote journals full of theories. She gestured vaguely toward the office. He said it feeds on despair, on the moment when hope dies. And the Vulovs, they had hours of that. Hours of slowly freezing, of waiting for rescue that never came. That's what it keeps. That's what it feeds on. I looked back at booth 3, so innocent looking in the fluorescent light, and the rules. Hemlock figured them out through trial and error. Terrible error. Marta's voice was bitter. 3 people died before he got it right. The rules aren't to protect the Vulovs. They're to protect us. To keep the entity contained. To keep it from spreading, from claiming anyone else. We're not witnesses, Anya. We're jailers. I pulled the laminated card from my pocket and looked at it again. And this time, the words didn't seem absurd. They seemed like a lifeline. A thin barrier between me and something vast and hungry. Why don't you just close the diner? I asked. Abandon it? Hemlock tried that in '83, left it empty for 3 months. The anomalies spread, started happening in people's homes, in the town itself. People reported seeing the Vulovs in their yards, hearing knocking on their storm cellars. The entity needs witnesses, needs someone to maintain the pattern. When we're here following the rules, it stays contained to this building. She stood up suddenly, looking every one of her years. You can quit. I won't judge you. I'll find someone else, or I'll keep doing it alone until I can't anymore. I should have quit. Every instinct screamed at me to walk out the door and keep walking. But I thought about my dead car, my empty bank account, and the fact that I had nowhere else to go. And maybe underneath all that practical desperation, there was something else. A recognition that I too was running from something I couldn't name, trapped in my own kind of loop. I'll stay, I heard myself say. Marta nodded slowly, like she'd expected this. Then memorize those rules like your life depends on them, because it does. I looked down at the card in my hands at the 6 rules written in faded type, and felt the weight of what I'd just agreed to settle over me like frost on a window. This wasn't a job. This wasn't even a haunting. Not in any traditional sense. This was a cage, and we were the keepers. The days blurred into nights, and the nights stretched into an endless loop of coffee, pie, and dread. I'd been working at the Aurora Borealis diner for 2 weeks, when the rhythm of the place finally settled into my bones. Not comfortably, but with the grim familiarity of a chronic ache you learn to live with. Every shift began the same way. Arrive at 7:45 p.m., tie on the navy apron, check that the laminated card was still in my pocket. Even though I'd memorized every word, the rules had become a mantra, a prayer I recited silently as I moved through the motions of refilling sugar dispensers and brewing fresh pots of coffee that would sit slowly burning through the long hours until dawn. But it was the waiting that hollowed me out. The knowledge that at 9:15 p.m., like clockwork, they would come, the Vulovs. Every single night, without fail, they manifested in booth 3, relived their terror and vanished, leaving nothing behind but the faint smell of ozone and my racing heartbeat. I'd learned to navigate around that window of time like a sailor avoiding a whirlpool. Between 9 DAW and 9:45 p.m., I busied myself in the kitchen or at the far end of the counter, my back carefully angled away from that corner booth. I never looked directly at them again after that first night, but I could feel their presence. A cold pressure in the air, a dimming of the lights, the way sound seemed to muffle and distort. The minor anomalies came gradually like a slow rising tide. There was a cold spot near the walk-in freezer that had nothing to do with its proximity to refrigeration. I'd be restocking supplies, and suddenly my breath would frost in front of my face, my fingers going numb despite the diner's oppressive heating system. The cold would cling to me for minutes after I left the area, as if something had reached out and brushed against my skin. Then there were the sounds. On calm nights, when the wind outside was nothing more than a whisper, I'd hear it. a low, keening howl that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It would last only seconds, but in those moments, the diner felt less like a building and more like a thin membrane stretched over something vast and hungry. Marta noticed my growing unease but said nothing. She moved through her shifts with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd made peace with horror long ago. Or perhaps who'd simply run out of the energy required to be afraid. It was a Thursday night, just past 10 p.m., when rule number 2 activated for the first time. The diner was empty except for us. The Volovs had come and gone at their appointed hour, and I was wiping down tables, grateful for the mindless repetition of the task. The old radio behind the counter played its usual mix of static-laden classic rock and country ballads, volume low enough to be ambient noise rather than company. Then the static swelled, crackling like breaking ice, and a new song began. I recognized it immediately, not from knowing the song, but from knowing what it meant. The opening notes were discordant, wrong, as if the radio was trying to play something its speakers weren't designed to produce. From Her to Eternity, the voice sang distorted and slow, like a tape played at the wrong speed. Marta's coffee cup hit the counter with a sharp crack. Anya Wall now. I didn't question it. Rule number 2 was seared into my memory. If the radio begins playing the weeping song by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, stop what you are doing and face the kitchen wall. Do not turn around until the song ends. We moved in unison, turning our backs to the diner, facing the grease-stained wall tiles of the kitchen pass through. I pressed my palms flat against the cool tile, focusing on the texture, the tiny imperfections in the grout, anything to ground myself in something real. The song continued, but it wasn't just music anymore. Beneath Nick Cave's baritone, I could hear other sounds weaving through the melody. The shriek of metal tearing, the crunch of glass shattering, the howl of wind so fierce it seemed to scream with a human voice. And underneath it all, threading through like a needle, was the sound of a child crying. Small, hopeless sobs that made my chest constrict. "Don't turn around," Marta whispered, her voice barely audible over the auditory nightmare. "It's showing us the memory. It's digesting." The temperature plummeted. I could see my breath now, rapid puffs of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. The lights flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall in front of me. I wanted desperately to turn to see what was happening behind us, but Marta's hand found my arm and gripped tight. "It wants you to look," she said. "That's how it spreads. That's how it claims." The song stretched on impossibly long, each second an eternity. I heard the crash again, louder now, so visceral I could almost feel the impact in my bones. A woman's scream cut short, a man shouting names. Alexei, Lena, his voice raw with panic. Then blessedly, mercifully, it ended. The final note dissolved into static, and the radio clicked off entirely, leaving us in perfect ringing silence. Neither of us moved for a long moment. When Marta finally released my arm and turned, I followed cautiously. The diner looked unchanged, booths empty, lights humming, everything exactly as it should be. But the air felt different, heavier, as if something had just passed through and left a residue behind. Marta walked to the radio and unplugged it with shaking hands. "That's the 4th time this year," she said quietly. "It's getting more frequent." We sat at the counter, and she poured us both coffee neither of us would drink. In the fluorescent light, I could see how deeply exhausted she truly was. Not just tired, but hollowed out, carved thin by years of carrying a burden no one should have to bear alone. "Old man Hemlock," she began, staring into her cup, "compiled the rules back in the 80s. He was a physicist before he retired up here. Thought he could figure out what the entity was, how it worked. He spent 5 years documenting everything." "What happened to him?" I asked. "Found him in 87 in the parking lot outside. Hypothermia," the coroner said, which made sense. It was January, 40 below with wind chill, but she paused, choosing her words carefully. "When they did the autopsy, they found frost inside his lungs like he'd breathed in the blizzard itself." My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. "He wasn't the first," Marcia continued. "Before the rules, 3 other employees died the same way. Always at night, always after violating one of the patterns Hemlock was starting to identify. One looked directly at the Volkovs. One tried to warn a customer about the window weather. One opened the storm cellar door. She met my eyes. The entity doesn't just feed on the Vulov's despair, Anna. It protects its food source. The rules aren't guidelines. They're a negotiated truce written in blood. I thought about the frostbite-patterned condensation I'd seen on the windows, the cold that clung to my skin near the freezer, and felt something tighten in my chest. "You should have told me this before," I said, but there was no anger in it, only weary understanding. "Would you have stayed?" I didn't answer because we both knew I would have. I'd had nowhere else to go. That's how these things always worked. The entity didn't need to hunt. It just waited for the desperate, the stranded, the ones with no choice but to walk through the door. 2 nights later, Marta's sister had a medical emergency in Fairbanks. She left at 7:00 p.m., a guilt and worry wearing on her face. "You'll be fine," she said, but I heard the question mark in it. "Follow the rules, all of them. I'll be back before closing if I can." I nodded, tied on my apron, and watched her taillights disappear down the highway, 2 red eyes swallowed by the vast darkness. The shift went smoothly until it didn't. The Vulovs appeared at 9:15, went through their silent horror show, and vanished at 9:26. I busied myself in the kitchen, counting down the minutes until their window closed, my shoulders finally relaxing at 9:46. I was in the storage room restocking napkins when I heard it. "Excuse me." The voice was small, trembling, and came from somewhere behind me, though the storage room was empty. "Can I have some hot chocolate? I'm so cold." My blood turned to ice. Rule number 4. Every cell in my body screamed at me to turn around, to look, to help whoever was speaking in that heartbreaking child's voice. But I knew it was Lena, the entity wearing her voice like a mask testing me. My mouth was dry as I forced out the words. "The kitchen is closed." "Please," the voice said, and now it was directly behind me. So close I could almost feel breath on my neck. "I'm so cold, it hurts. Please, just something warm. The kitchen is closed," I repeated louder this time, and said nothing else. The silence that followed was worse than the voice. It pressed down on me, expectant, hungry. Then the walk-in freezer door behind me rattled violently in its frame, the metal shaking like something inside was trying to get out. I bit down on my lip hard enough to taste blood and stayed perfectly still. The rattling stopped as abruptly as it began, but before I could even exhale in relief, a new sound erupted from deeper in the storage area. Knocking. Frantic, desperate knocking from the storm cellar door. Rule number 5. The knocking escalated into a pounding, fists against wood with the force of pure desperation. I forced my legs to move to carry me to the door. It was old, thick oak, and I could feel the impacts reverberating through the floor. "Let us in." The voice was muffled, but clear, frozen, and raw. "Please, we're freezing the children. God, please, someone help us. We can't feel our hands anymore." It was Ivan's voice, the father begging. My hand trembled as I raised it to the door. The wood was ice cold, colder than anything I'd ever touched. I could see frost spreading from where my palm made contact, white tendrils creeping across the surface like veins. I started counting backward. 10. The pounding grew more frantic. "Please, I can't feel Lena anymore. She's not breathing right, please." 9. My voice cracked. "My son is turning blue. Please, please, please." 8. 7. 6. I forced the numbers out through tears that froze on my cheeks. The voice dissolved into wordless screaming, pure agony and terror, the sound of hope dying in real time. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Absolute silence, so sudden and complete it felt like falling. I pulled my hand away from the door and stared at my palm. The skin was marked with faint white patterns, not quite frostbite, but something that looked disturbingly similar. Delicate branching lines like frost on a window concentrated where my palm had pressed against the wood. They didn't hurt, but they didn't fade either. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to call. Marta answered on the second ring. "Anya, what's wrong?" Rule 4 and 5. I managed together and Marta. I held up my marked hand, though she couldn't see it. It touched me. The door. When I counted down, something happened. My hand. "What about your hand?" Her voice went sharp with alarm. "It's marked like frostbite, but not like frost crystals under the skin." The silence on the other end stretched too long. When Marta finally spoke, her voice was shaking. "The frost? That's new. They've never touched anyone before." A pause. "Anya, I'm 2 hours away. Lock the front door. Don't let anyone in. Don't engage with anything else. I'm coming back." She hung up, leaving me alone in the fluorescent glare of the diner. I looked down at my palm again at the delicate frost pattern etched into my skin and felt something shift in my understanding. The rules had kept us safe by keeping us separate. Observers, not participants. But something had changed. The entity wasn't just repeating its loop anymore. It knew I was there. And now, it had marked me. I was no longer just a keeper of the cage. Somehow, I'd become part of the horror itself. The frost marks on my palm didn't fade. 3 days after that night, alone in the diner, the delicate white patterns remained etched into my skin like a brand. They didn't hurt, didn't spread, but they were always cold to the touch, as if I'd trapped a piece of that entity inside my own flesh. When I ran my fingers over them, I could almost hear the echo of that desperate knocking, feel the terror pressed against the other side of that door. It was that marking more than anything else that drove me to the Frost End Public Library on a gray Tuesday afternoon, when I should have been sleeping before my shift. The library was a small, weathered building tucked between the general store and the post office. Its wooden sign faded by decades of harsh winters. Inside, it smelled of old paper and heating oil, the kind of place that felt frozen in time. Shelves of cracked spines, vinyl chairs with duct-taped armrests, and a circulation desk that looked older than the town itself. The librarian was a man in his 70s with wire-rimmed glasses and suspenders, his name tag reading Harold. He looked up from a crossword puzzle when I entered, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to weary recognition. "You're the new girl at the diner," he said. It wasn't a question. "Anya," I replied, "I need to research something. Do you keep archives of the local newspaper?" His pen stopped mid-word. "Depends on what you're looking for." I pulled my hand from my pocket and showed him the frost marks. The Volkov family. January 1971, Harold's face went pale. He set down his pen with deliberate care, removed his glasses, and cleaned them on his cardigan. A delay tactic, buying time to decide something. Finally, he stood. "Microfiche is in the back room," he said quietly. "The Frost End Sentinel. I'll get you set up." The microfiche reader was ancient, its screen yellowed and flickering. Harold loaded the reels with practiced efficiency, his hands shaking slightly as he threaded the film. "January 16th, 1971, he murmured, advancing the frames. Front page. The headline appeared in grainy black and white. "Local family perishes in blizzard tragedy." I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen. The article described the discovery of the Vulov's truck 20 mi north of Frost End, buried in snowdrifts after the worst blizzard in a decade. Ivan Volkov, 38, Sasha Vulov, 35. Their children, Alexei, 12, and Lena, 8. All four found dead inside the vehicle, victims of exposure and hypothermia. Authorities believe the family became disoriented during the storm and crashed into a roadside ditch around 6:30 p.m. on January 15th. I read aloud. Search parties discovered the vehicle at approximately 8 a.m. the following morning. Harold reached past me and advanced the film several more frames. That's the public story. This is what came 2 weeks later. A smaller article appeared buried on page 6. Coroner's report details Volkov tragedy. My stomach twisted as I read. The coroner had determined that the Volkovs did not die on impact. The crash had damaged the truck's heating system and jammed the doors, but the family survived the initial accident. They were trapped, conscious, and aware as the temperature dropped to 43 degrees below zero. Based on body temperature calculations and gastric content analysis, the coroner estimated they'd survived between 6 and 8 hours before succumbing to hypothermia. The youngest child, Lena Vulov, was found clutched in her mother's arms, the report stated. Evidence suggests the family remained alert and communicative for the majority of their ordeal. Multiple distress signals were found scratched into the truck's interior. I sat back, my marked hand pressed against my chest. 6 to 8 hours, an entire night of cold, of hope slowly dying, of believing rescue would come and then realizing it wouldn't, of watching your children freeze. "They didn't just die," I whispered. "They waited to die." Harold nodded slowly. The entity doesn't feed on death, does it? It feeds on that moment between hope and acceptance. The Vulovs had hours of it. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. The knocking on the storm cellar door wasn't them trying to escape the truck. It was the memory of Ivan trying to get his family out, pounding on jammed doors while the blizzard raged outside. Lena's voice asking for hot chocolate wasn't a random haunting. It was what she'd asked for in those final hours when her lips were turning blue and her fingers couldn't feel anymore. The loop wasn't just the moment they saw death coming. It was the entire agonizing period of their dying. "The entity," I said, looking up at Harold. Marcia mentioned someone who studied it. Old Man Hemlock. Harold's expression shifted, something between relief and sadness crossing his weathered features. He disappeared into a back room and returned several minutes later carrying a banker's box, its cardboard softened with age. "Thomas Hemlock left this with me in 1987, he said, setting it on the table beside the microfiche reader. "Made me promise I'd only share it with someone who asked the right questions. He said I'd know when that happened." Harold gestured to my marked palm. "I reckon this counts." Inside the box were journals, 5 leather-bound notebooks filled with dense handwriting, diagrams, and newspaper clippings. I opened the first one, dated March 1982. "I have come to understand," Hemlock's precise script began, "that what haunts the Aurora Borealis diner is not a ghost in any traditional sense, but rather a wound in the fabric of reality itself. I call it the Echo Eater." I flipped through pages of observations, theories, and desperate attempts at scientific explanation. Hemlock had been a physicist before retiring to Alaska, and his approach was methodical, almost clinical, even as the horror of what he described seeped through every word. "The entity exists outside linear time." I read aloud. "It doesn't haunt a location so much as it creates a pocket of recursive despair, a feeding loop that sustains itself on the psychic energy of profound suffering. The Vulovs are not spirits. They are echoes, imprints of consciousness trapped at the moment when hope transforms into absolute terror." Further in, Hemlock theorized that the entity was drawn to frost, and by something older, a wound created by the collective despair of countless creatures who died in Alaska's wilderness over millennia. The Vulovs had simply been the most recent and most potent source of the specific emotional frequency it consumed. But it was the final journal, dated October 1987, that made my breath catch. "I believe I have found a way to free them," Hemlock wrote, "not through force or containment, but through acknowledgement. The entity feeds on despair that comes from being forgotten, from dying alone and unremembered. If the Volkovs could be shown, truly shown, that they are remembered, that their deaths mattered, that they are not forgotten, the entity would lose its hold on their psychic energy. They could finally rest." He'd outlined a plan, a memorial service held at the diner during the manifestation window. Gather the community, speak their names, prove they weren't forgotten, show them their suffering was over. The final entry was dated November 3rd, 1987. "I will attempt the memorial tomorrow. If this works, the horror ends. If not, I pray whoever finds this understands what must be done." Harold cleared his throat. "They found Thomas in the parking lot on November 5th. Hypothermia, the coroner said, but he was wearing a winter coat rated for 60 below, and the temperature that night was only 20. They found frost inside his lungs." I looked at the journals spread before me, at the careful documentation of horror, and the slim thread of hope woven through it. Hemlock had tried alone. He'd failed because he tried alone. "I need to show these to Marcia," I said. Harold nodded. "I think Thomas would have wanted that." That evening, before our shift, I spread the journals across one of the diner tables. Marta read in silence, her coffee growing cold beside her, her expression cycling through recognition, grief, and finally something that looked like determination. "He was right," she said at last about all of it, and his plan. She looked up at me. "We could try again, not on the exact anniversary. We've already missed that by months, but we could hold the memorial this summer, June 15th. That would mark 54 years and 5 months. Close enough to honor them properly." I understood the logic. Planning something this significant would take time, finding relatives, gathering the community, preparing, and there was something symbolically powerful about choosing our own date rather than being bound by the entity's calendar. "We'd need to find someone who knew them," I said, "someone who could speak about them personally." Marta was already nodding. "Let me make some calls." Sasha had family in Anchorage, a cousin if she's still alive. Over the next month, as spring shifted towards summer and we prepared, the entity pushed back. The manifestations changed. The vols began appearing earlier than 9:15. First, by 5 minutes, then 10. They manifested in places they shouldn't. I glimpsed Lena standing near the freezer at 700 p.m., her yellow dress stark against the industrial gray. Marta saw Ivan in the parking lot at dawn, staring at the highway. The cold spots multiplied, the windows frosted over. Even during warm June days, the radio played fragments of the weeping song at random intervals, never long enough to trigger rule number 2, just enough to keep us on edge. And then one night during the regular 9:15 manifestation, Ivan Vulov turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were the gray-white of freezing fog. His mouth opened and his voice emerged like cracking ice. "Are you coming? We have been waiting." I stood frozen, remembering rule number 6. Remain calm. Answer honestly. But I had no answer. I didn't know what he was asking. Beside him, the north-facing windows showed a blizzard pressing against the glass with unnatural force. Snow horizontal in wind that howled silently. The glass bowed inward, as if something vast were leaning against it from the other side. Then they were gone, leaving only the smell of ozone and my racing heart. "It knows," Marta said quietly. "It knows we're planning something." She was right. The entity sensed the disruption coming, felt us preparing to sever its connection to its food source. It was fighting back the only way it knew how, through fear, through escalation, through the threat of spreading beyond its containment. But we didn't stop. Marta's calls bore fruit. Sasha's cousin, a woman named Nadia Vulov-Chen, was alive and living in Anchorage. When Marta explained what we wanted to do, there was a long silence on the phone. "Then I'll come. I should have done something like this years ago." We printed flyers, posted notices at the general store and post office. Memorial service for the Volkov family. June 15th, 9 p.m., Aurora Borealis Diner. To our surprise, people responded. Old-timers who remembered the tragedy. Younger residents who'd heard the stories. Marta's friends, Harold the librarian, even the mechanic who'd finally gotten my car running. 3 months it had taken, but I'd stayed and now I had no intention of leaving until this was finished. June 15th arrived with a weather warning. Freak snowstorm expected to hit Frost End area this evening. The radio announced that morning. Unseasonable conditions developing. Travelers advised extreme caution. I looked out the diner windows at the bright June sunshine, at the green hills and the wild flowers blooming along the highway. The thermometer outside read 68 degrees. There shouldn't be snow. Not in the middle of an Alaskan summer. Marcia and I looked at each other across the diner. Through the windows, the sky in the north was already darkening unnaturally, clouds rowing in patterns that didn't match any weather system I'd ever seen. "It knows," I said. "Of course it knows," Marta replied, her jaw set. "We're coming for its meal." As the afternoon wore on, the temperature began to drop. By evening, as people started arriving for the memorial, the first snowflakes were falling against the summer sun. Fat, wet flakes that shouldn't exist, that defied every natural law. The entity was rewriting reality itself, pulling winter into summer, trying to recreate the conditions of that January night 54 years ago. I felt the frost marks on my palm pulse with cold. Outside, the impossible storm gathered strength. Inside, we set up folding chairs and lit candles. The entity was fighting back. But for the first time since I'd arrived in Frost End, I understood something that Hemlock had known. Sometimes the only way to end a horror is to face it directly, to refuse to let fear and despair have the final word. Tonight we would remember the Vulovs. Tonight we would break their loop, or we would die trying. By 8 Sauk, the parking lot was full. I watched through the diner windows as cars arrived one after another, their headlights cutting through the thickening snowfall that shouldn't exist. Families emerged, bundled in summer jackets, hastily pulled over t-shirts, their breath fogging in air that had dropped 30 degrees in 3 hours. The impossible storm swirled around them, June snow falling like accusations from a darkening sky. Inside, the Aurora Borealis diner had been transformed. Marta and I had pushed tables aside to create an open space facing booth 3, setting up folding chairs borrowed from the community center. Candles lined every surface, the counter, the windowsills, the tables, their flames steady and warm against the unnatural darkness pressing against the glass. In the center of it all, on a small table draped with white cloth, sat a framed photograph we'd found in the Sentinel archives. The Vulov family, taken in happier times. Ivan with his arm around Sasha, both smiling. Alexei and Lena grinning at the camera, gap-toothed and alive. "She's here," Marta said softly, touching my arm. I turned to see an elderly woman being helped through the door by Harold the librarian. She was small, bent with age, her white hair covered by a scarf dotted with melting snowflakes. But her eyes, when they met mine, were sharp and clear, and carried the weight of decades of grief. "Nadia Vulov-Chen," Marta said, making introductions. "This is Anya." Nadia took my hand in both of hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong, but I felt her tremble when she saw my palm, the frost mark still visible, pale against my skin. "So it's true," she whispered. "All these years," I thought. I hoped they were at rest. She looked toward booth 3 and tears filled her eyes. My cousin Sasha, we were like sisters growing up. When she died, her voice broke. I never got to say goodbye. Tonight, you will, I said with more certainty than I felt. By 9:43, people filled the diner. I recognized faces from town. The mechanic who'd fixed my car, the postal clerk, old Mrs. Henderson, who always ordered soup. Harold sat near the front, Hemlock's journals in his lap like a talisman. Others I didn't know, people who'd driven from surrounding towns, drawn by the flyers or old memories or something they couldn't quite name. The storm raged outside with increasing fury. Snow piled against the windows and drifts, and the wind howled like something wounded and angry. The temperature inside had dropped despite the heating system running at full blast. Everyone kept their jackets on, their breath visible in small puffs. Marta checked her watch. 5 minutes, she said quietly. I nodded and moved to the front of the gathering, standing beside the photograph. My heart hammered against my ribs. The candles flickered in unison as if touched by a breath that came from everywhere and nowhere. Thank you all for coming, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. We're here tonight to remember 4 people who died 54 years ago on a January night much like this one. I gestured toward the impossible storm outside. The Vulovs, Ivan, Sasha, Alexei, and Lena. They were a family. They were loved. And for too long, their suffering has been forgotten. I explained what we intended to do, though I sensed most already understood. Some had been touched by the entity's reach over the years. Cold spots in their homes, faint voices in the wind, dreams of freezing. They'd come not just to help the Volkovs, but to help themselves, to push back against the horror that had seeped into the edges of their community. When they appear, I said, meeting eyes around the room, we're going to show them something they haven't seen in 54 years. We're going to show them they're not forgotten, that they matter, that their deaths were not meaningless. Marta's watch beeped. 9:15. For a moment, nothing happened. The diner was silent except for the howl of wind and the collective held breath of 43 people. Then the air in booth 3 began to shimmer. They materialized as they always did. Ivan in his brown corduroy jacket, Sasha in her floral dress, Alexei and Lena huddled close. But this time, something was different. They appeared and then stopped, froze mid-motion as if the loop had hit an unexpected obstacle. Ivan's face, usually locked in that expression of dawning horror, flickered with confusion. He looked around the diner, seeing not the empty restaurant of every previous night, but a crowd of people watching, waiting, witnessing. His gaze fell on the photograph, on the image of his family alive and smiling. Sasha gasped, a sound I'd never heard them make before, breaking through the usual silence. She clutched her children tighter, but not in terror, in recognition. Now, Marta whispered. I stepped forward, my voice clear and strong. Ivan Vulov, Sasha Vulov, Alexei Vulov, Lena Vulov. I spoke each name like a prayer, like an anchor. You are remembered. You are not alone anymore. Around the room, voices joined mine. You are remembered. You are not alone. The entity reacted immediately. The diner shook, a violent tremor that sent candles toppling and knocked the photograph to the floor. The radio behind the counter exploded to life, not with the weeping song, but with a shriek of static. So loud several people clapped hands over their ears. The windows bowed inward under impossible pressure, frost spreading across the glass in patterns that looked like screaming faces. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in clouds of ice crystals. The phantom cold was biting, vicious, desperate. The entity was fighting back, trying to reassert its grip to pull the Vulovs back into the loop of despair it had fed on for decades. But Nadia stood. The old woman moved forward with determination, and I helped steady her as she approached booth 3. She looked at Sasha's confused, flickering form with eyes full of love and grief. Sasha, Nadia said, her voice cracking. It's me. It's Nadia. Do you remember? We used to play in the meadow behind our grandmother's house. You taught me to braid flowers into crowns. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. I've missed you every day for 54 years, but you don't have to hurt anymore. You don't have to be afraid. You can rest now. The entity shrieked. Not a sound, but a feeling. A pressure in the skull, a wrongness in the air. The lights flickered wildly. The blizzard outside raged with the fury of something dying, but something was changing in the Vulovs. The terror on their faces, that frozen expression of helpless horror, began to melt. Confusion gave way to recognition, then to something that looked like understanding. Sasha's hand reached toward Nadia, not quite touching, but the gesture was clear. Gratitude, love, release. Ivan looked at me, and for the first time his eyes weren't the gray-white of freezing fog. They were brown, human, aware. His mouth moved, and though no sound came out, I could read his lips. Thank you. Little Lena, who I'd heard crying for hot chocolate in the darkness, who'd been trapped in terror for longer than she'd been alive, smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it transformed her face completely. The Volkov family turned, not toward the north-facing windows where the phantom blizzard raged, not toward the memory of their death, but toward the front door, toward the way out. They walked together, hand in hand, through the crowd. People reached out as they passed, not touching, but offering, gestures of compassion, of acknowledgement, of love. With each step, the Vulov's forms became fainter, more translucent, but paradoxically, more peaceful. The pain was dissolving. The fear was lifting. At the door, Sasha turned back once. She looked at me, at Marta, at Nadia, at all of us who'd gathered to remember them. Her lips moved. We were not forgotten. Then they stepped through the door and into the impossible June snowstorm. And they dissolved, not into darkness, not into horror, into light. Their forms broke apart like they were made of stars, scattering upward into the night sky in a cascade of brilliance that looked exactly like the northern lights, green and gold and ethereal, dancing across the darkness. The aurora borealis, nature's most beautiful memorial. The moment they dissipated completely, the storm stopped. Not gradually, instantly. The howling wind cut off mid-shriek. The snow ceased falling. Through the windows, I watched the clouds tear apart, revealing the clear June night sky that should have been there all along. The temperature inside the diner rose so quickly that condensation formed on every cold surface. The oppressive presence, that weight I'd carried for months without fully realizing it was there, lifted. The air felt clean, light, free. Someone started crying, then someone else. Not from fear or horror, but from relief, from release, from the simple, profound understanding that something terrible had finally ended. 4 months later, I stood alone in the Aurora Borealis diner on a quiet December evening, locking up after my shift as day manager. Marta had retired in September, moving to Anchorage to be closer to her sister. She'd left me the diner, signing the papers with shaking hands and eyes full of tears. "You freed them," she'd said. "You freed all of us. Keep this place running, but not as a prison, as a diner. Just a diner." And that's what it had become. Booth 3 was just a booth now, usually occupied by truckers drinking coffee or families ordering pie. The laminated card with its 6 rules sat in my office drawer, a historical curiosity. I'd shown it to Harold once, and we'd agreed to donate it to the local historical society eventually, along with Hemlock's journals. The manifestations had stopped completely after that June night. No cold spots, no phantom voices, no windows showing impossible weather. The entity, starved of its primary food source, had gone dormant, or perhaps moved on, or simply ceased to exist. I like to think it was the latter, that by freeing the Volkovs, we'd healed the wound in reality that had created the Echo Eater in the first place. I walked to booth 3 and set down a mug of hot chocolate. I'd made real cocoa with marshmallows floating on top, still steaming. Not because a rule compelled me, not because a child's voice would ask for it from the shadows, but because it felt right. A gesture of remembrance, a small ritual of peace. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the table, and smiled. For just a heartbeat, I felt it. A wave of warmth that had nothing to do with the diner's heating system. And on the wind outside, though the night was calm, I heard something that might have been laughter. Young, happy, free. The frost marks on my palm had faded months ago, leaving only the faintest trace, like a scar from a wound that had finally healed. They were at peace, and so finally was I.